Well, g'day folks, thanks for tuning in. Today's video is one in a series of colour theory, where we'll be looking at the colour blue. In this series we explore how a given colour can be transformed by other colours, giving us new and exciting ways to paint. The goal here is to take these three space marines and apply the same blue over a different foundational layer, to show how those colours influence it, and to show how to achieve different shades of blue with just a bit of planning. You can see here that I've kept my palette pretty focused. If you're following along with your own paints, don't worry, as the general colour or hue is far more important than the specific pigments that I have out here. But for reference, I've got titanium white, brilliant yellow pale, fanchon red, phthalo blue, dioxazine purple, burnt umber, and indigo. The red is only out there for the lenses, and it's the last three that are going to be our foundational colours: purple, brown, and dark blue. The blue we'll be using today is phthalo blue from Winsor & Newton's Winton line. This is a student grade blue that's common in a lot of starters, so it should be easy to get your hands on. One alternative is French ultramarine blue, like this one, which is also common in starter sets. But I went with phthalo as it's a little more natural, which will let our foundational colours have more of an influence. Feel free to experiment with whatever blues you have available, as the principles we're exploring here will apply to them. For thinner, I'll be using just a capful of odourless paint thinner from Speedball, which is a very mild thinner that I find easy to work with. A little bit of this stuff goes a long way, and we don't need much to be effective. Now, if you'd like more information about the kinds of products I like to use, you can check out my video on getting started with oils, which I'll link down in the description. Like with all of my videos, I want to try to help people get over a fear of colour mixing, whether you use oil paint or not, and to show that you don't need dozens of different pigments in order to get the result that you're looking for. So let's get started. For brushes, we're going to start with this beat up Royal Langnickel size 8, which you can get in bulk like most craft brushes for a few cents each. Since we're effectively applying a base coat with these, our brush doesn't need to be fancy, and the splayed bristles here will help us get our paint down in all the nooks and crannies. So first we take our indigo, or dark blue, and mix in a touch of thinner so it'll cover more easily. We don't want to flood the miniature, but we want it thin enough that it'll get in all the recesses without too much coaxing. We're also not concerned about using too much paint here, as we're actually going to be wiping the bulk of it away once it's had a chance to tint the miniature. We're being very casual here, just going around the miniature, covering all the parts that we want to be blue. As I mentioned, a dark blue can be a great foundation for metallics, so we're also going to be applying it to the weapon. If some gets on the base, no problem, just try to keep a loose focus at this stage. When I'm done with this step, I wring out my brush on a paper towel, which you can see is pretty effective at getting the bulk of the paint out. Doing this will help you save on cleaner, as when I go to clean this brush later on, I'll need far less of it. Now I've sped up the video here, but you can see that the process is the same for our purple and our burnt umber. Just slap it all over the marine, not caring if we get a little bit of overspill. What we're doing here is what James Wapple calls the pre-glaze. The colours we're using now will influence our subsequent layers. Colour theory helps us decide which colours to use, which I'll expand on as we go. For the base, I'm taking more of that burnt umber and working it in. We'll need a bit more thinner here, as the basing material and texture absorbs the paint differently, and our recesses are harder to get into. If you get some on the boots, that's no problem, as that'll help integrate our model with the base, or in the case of our brown marine, not matter at all. And here I'm just quickly revisiting the weapons on the other two. I'm not even changing brushes, as a bit of brown in our dark blue is only going to bring it towards black, which is just fine for our gunmetal. And here we are, deep in the ugly phase of our paint job. Next we'll be wiping most of this away, setting the stage for our blues and for the magic to finally start happening. You may have noticed a bit of splatter happening during the last stage, which can get quite messy. I took a paper towel with a touch of thinner on it and wiped my surfaces down while I let the miniature sit for a few minutes. Next I'll be using these makeup sponges, which I've cut to various sizes in order to wipe away our foundational layer. These are cheap and plentiful and very useful. Take a sponge and start wiping. You'll notice how much paint's coming away, but also how well that indigo has tinted the miniature. Some colours do this better than others, but most will have some impact. We're essentially creating a value sketch here, wiping from the direction we want our light source to be, and the results are pretty dramatic. I'm using different sponges for the weapons and the bases to minimise cross-contamination, but I'm not bothered if a mixing occurs. And here they are. As you can see, with a bit of care and planning, you could get a tabletop ready mini with just these two steps alone, but we're going to take it further. Time to introduce our blue. So once again, we're using our cheap craft brushes for this stage. Here I have a size 6 flat, that I've trimmed the corners off to give it a rounded filbert shape. These rounded edges are going to help with our blends, so I recommend taking the time if you're not using actual filberts already. We're going to work some blue into our brush and then wipe off the excess on a paper towel. We don't need a lot of paint from here on out, and less is always more with oils. We take our mini and start applying our blue, brushing from the top to bottom in light, gentle strokes. Straight away the indigo from our foundational layer starts mixing in, darkening our blue. The colour theory here is pretty straightforward. A darker blue is an obvious shadow colour, and as we work our way down, the paint that's mixing in on the brush is going to make each stroke progressively darker. When we reload, we start again from the top. Now the purple gives us a more saturated, vibrant looking blue. The blue in the purple makes it a foundational candidate for the same reasons as the indigo, but the red here gives it some punch, and the higher overall value of the purple causes less desaturation than the indigo. If you're looking for a more fantasy look, consider purple. Conversely, the burnt umber has the opposite effect. Brown is just desaturated orange, and orange is complementary to blue, as it sits opposite it on the colour wheel. When complements mix, they tend to cancel each other out and become less saturated. Mixing blue and brown in equal parts is a great way to get a black that's more visually interesting than just straight black paint. But here, the brown foundation dulls down our blue, giving a dramatic, grimdark look, even more so than the blue over the indigo. You can see on the back that it's closer to black, turning almost green in the process. A bit more blue will bring that back up to where we want it. In the meantime, our purple marine on the left is looking more and more like a blueberry. Again, this is the same blue over a different foundation. I'm either cleaning out or replacing my brush in between marines, so that there's no cross-contamination at this stage. With oils, the model becomes the palette all on its own, opening up a world of possibilities. Here they are side by side. Dark blue on the left, purple in the middle, and brown on the right. You can see how the foundational layer has not only changed our blue, but it's done a lot of our shading for us. So let's continue to build on it, and refine some of the mess that we've made in this early stage. We're going to highlight our blue in much the same way here, by adding a bit of white. You can see on the palette that I've got separate areas for each marine. So let's start with our indigo base. Same process as before. Load it up, wipe off the excess, and come in from our light source, this time focusing on a smaller area and trying to be a little bit more precise with our application. As our colours are mixing on the model, you can highlight in greater leaps than you might otherwise think. This saves a lot of time as we don't have to incrementally apply each layer like we might with acrylics. I'm leaving the areas most in shadow, like the inside of the legs, and I'm generally brushing from one direction. We can apply a light touch here and there in areas of less shadow, like underneath the pauldrons, and in this way we can create a variety of values from this one highlight colour. Those spots that aren't blended or are more brushstroke heavy will be refined in a little bit. Right now we're just continuing that value sketch and building up our tones. Same again with the purple marine. While the white desaturates our blue, the blue we're applying it over in this case is more saturated than that on our brown marine, so it retains a bit more of its vibrancy. On the other hand, our brown marine continues to take that desaturated look even further, even with highlights. Our foundational layers are continuing to work here, and those greener areas on the brown are a lot more obvious now. But this isn't necessarily a bad thing, as it does create a bit of visual interest, although you could always add a bit more blue to your mix if that's what you're after. Now to get rid of these brush strokes and enhance our blends. We come in with a clean round brush. I prefer Sables for these as they are softer, but really any brush will do you. Here we're gently scumbling, which is tapping with the side of the brush, and in seconds those harsh transitions all blend together. It's important that we keep our blending brush clean and dry, as an accumulation of paint will begin to tear at the areas that we want to blend instead. This is another reason why less is always more when applying paint. So we wring our brush out on a paper towel periodically, or just get a fresh one. In just a couple of minutes our model is looking a lot neater, and is ready for the next step. And here they are all after that initial highlight, followed by some tidying up with our blending brush. I'll be using a dedicated fill bit brush for this stage, as I want these highlights to be more focused than the craft brushes will let us be. We can also use the narrow side of the brush to do some edge highlighting. And once again I'm applying white into the mix. Again, not worrying about how bright it appears on the palette. Once I start applying it, it'll look more at home as it mixes in. Same direction as before, directional strokes across the areas that the light would catch, over a progressively smaller area. If I get too zealous or create too stark a transition, then I just come in with my blending brush and tap it all back in. Easy as that. Now we're going to move in the other direction and re-establish some shadows, as all this overbrushing has knocked a few of them out. Here I've got a size 3/0, again a synthetic that's seen better days. We can still use a brush like this to do some detail work, as we don't have to worry about the paint drying out on the tip like we would with acrylics. Because our base blue is quite dark, we can use it to re-establish shadows while leaving our foundational colour for the deepest recesses. So here I'm just tapping that phthalo blue into the underside of the knee pad and the inside of the thighs, and like with the highlights, I can come in with a blending brush to smooth the transition. We're getting the contrast back pretty quickly here, and bringing more blue back into the mini. Here you want to think about where your light source is coming from, and be mindful of the shapes that you're painting. Spheres such as the knee pads, pauldrons and helmet, and parts of the backpack, cylinders for the legs and the arms. Different shapes have got different rules for how they reflect light, and by breaking down our model into shapes, we can more easily apply those rules. And again, spend as much time as you feel you need to on this step. Here they are together. Even though we've reapplied that same blue on top of everything else we've done, all three models still look distinct though, due to our foundational work. We can take our shading further however, as we've lost a bit of definition between elements, so let's do that next. We're going to be using a different technique for this step, called pin line washing. We'll need a different brush for that. I recommend a fine brush with a long tip, like the size 10/0 liner brush. Like the others, it can be a bit beat up, as once we load it with thinner, its tip will naturally return to a point. Here we're going to use an abundance of thinner to create a wash of our foundational colour, which we'll let run into our recesses and re-establish our shadows for us. This method means we don't have to risk our highlights by trying to brush in the shadows between where these elements meet. Now yes, too much thinner can eat away at your work, so we're going for a light touch. We want it fairly liquid, like you can see on the palette, but not so much that it's dripping off the brush. You can test your mix on a paper towel, or find a spot on the mini, like the underside of the knee pad, and just touch the brush to the recess. A capillary action should draw the wash from your brush, and just like magic, it'll fill that space without spilling over. Getting the right mix of paint and thinner will depend on the paint that you're using, so there's no hard and fast rule I can teach you, but it's very easy to make adjustments as you go. Just start with less thinner, and if it's not pulling into the recesses, add more. This is a very relaxing step. Just go around the model, tapping those recesses, and let your paints work for you. Now if you've added too much and get some spillover, or just missed the mark, no worries, just leave it. Often the blemish will disappear on its own as that thinner evaporates, but if it doesn't, then you can come in with your blending brush and tap it away after a few minutes. Here the longer you wait the better, as you don't want the thinner to turn your brush into an eraser. If I make a mistake here, I just keep working around the mini, giving that mistake time to set, and then I come back in with my blending brush when I'm done. Our minis are looking a lot more defined now, and we can really see that separation between all the armor panels. But next we're going to tackle the other elements, and really bring it all together. I'm going to keep this part pretty quick and simple, and start with black for our cabling. Even though we don't have black on the palette, we can easily make some by mixing our indigo and our burnt umber. Our complementary blue and orange make grey, and these dark desaturated tones will push that grey into an interesting chromatic black. While this video is about blue, I do want to spend a couple of minutes on these elements, as we need to define them in order for our armour to really start making sense. So we come in with our black, and apply it to the undersuit of the armour, the cabling of the backpack, and the grip of the pistol. We're just looking to quickly define these elements, so once they're blocked in, we add a bit of white to our black, gently overbrush it, letting that sculpt catch the brush and do our highlighting work for us. And once that's done, we add a bit more white and tap in our final highlight. In just a handful of strokes, we have those elements blocked, defined, and highlighted. Now if you wanted, you could also come back in with a wash of the black to get into those recesses, but we'll be moving on here. I was initially going to paint the leathers in a rich brown, as it would contrast nicely with the blue, but I decided to try something a bit different, and we're going for more of a black brown instead. By adding more umber into our indigo mix, we can push our black paint towards brown. On its own it still reads as black, but you can see next to our initial mix on the palette there's a big difference. Here we're just slapping it on the holster and the pouches, letting them get blocked in. You can add white or brilliant yellow pale to the mix, depending on how warm you want the highlights to be. As leather tends to be either quite reflective or covered in distressed scuffs and scratches, I find a strong jump in value works well when highlighting it. I'm doing a rough edge highlight and then coming in with my blending brush, but unlike before, I'm more or less stabbing it in. Now this stippling technique is great for creating weathering, as the stippling motion blends unevenly and creates a really distressed look. And again, mixing in more highlight, picking out not only the edges but random parts of the surface where the leather might be more worn, and stabbing it in. This works in both directions, and I can come back in with my darks to reinforce both my shadows and the overall texture. You can spend a long time going back and forth with this technique, but it doesn't take much to get a good result. For the eyes, our red finally gets some action. Here I'm mixing in a bit of umber to create a darker base tone, and then a bit of blue for interest. You could mix any of our foundational colours in here to darken it down, as purple, brown and blue, they all play nicely with red. And using the same liner brush from our wash stage, I gently applied the base red of the lenses, just a couple of strokes to get it blocked in. Then with some pure red, just a touch more towards the front. Some brilliant yellow pale will create a cool pink look for our final highlight, and we put just a dot of that towards the front of each lens. Lastly, a touch of pure white to make a reflective dot at the back in the middle of our base colour. You can use this technique on lenses, gems, or any reflective transparent material. Now if I make a mistake, as you can do at this stage since it's so precise, I can blend it away, or come in with a wash to restore that definition. And there we are, quick and easy lenses. Now for the weapons and trim, I wanted to take a quick detour and dispel a common myth that you can't use metallic paints with oils. We actually have a few options here, as you can see out on the palette. You can buy metallic oil paint, like the silver from Gamblin', and we can mix other colours in to create a variety of tones. Typically I'll use either brown or blue, like umber or indigo, to make my gunmetal, steel, iron and so on, and then progressively highlight with more silver. While it's real easy to go darker, one thing you can't do with these is go lighter. Mixing in white just ruins the metallic effect, so whatever metallic paint you're starting with needs to be your highest value. But if you wanted to go brighter, something like this iridescent pearl white from Williamsburg is one way to go. Another option is to mix your own metallic paint. Once again, credit goes to James Wapple for the inspiration here. All it takes is some metallic pigment powder and some linseed oil, and in this case I've used powders from Green Stuff World. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a video dedicated to this. While it might sound daunting, it's actually really easy to do, and very affordable if you're looking to paint a lot of gold, bronze, copper, and so on. Once again we have our fake filbert brush. I recommend using clean brushes and a separate cup of thinner for metallics, so that mica doesn't get mixed around. I'm mixing in a bit of indigo, and you can see how dark that gets in no time at all. The process is just the same as before. We start brushing from our light source across the weapon. One of the frustrations I had with painting metallics and acrylics was blending them in, but we don't have that problem here. Like other colours, it blends while we paint, and we can still come in with a blending brush to get an even smoother transition if we need to. Some straight indigo followed by our blending brush really pushes that contrast, but it doesn't kill the shine. Our custom paints work much in the same way. I've got a smaller brush here as we're going to be working the trim around the pauldrons, starting with the copper. These pigments are quite opaque, and even with the blue underneath they go on smooth. But even then, if we make a mistake, we can blend it away just as easily as with any other colour. For the next highlight, I'm going to be using some bronze on the upward facing edges. And honestly, I'm happy with the result just from these two colours, but to give it a bit more pop, we can take out our silver and hit the corners. And here are all three marines with the detail work done. If you don't have or aren't interested in using metallics with oils, you could easily use acrylics instead once the rest of your minis dry, but I wanted to give a quick demo of the possibilities. Again, let me know if you'd like to see a dedicated video on this. Now, let's get back into our final highlights. So off camera I quickly did the purity seals, which were just white with a bit of umber mixed in, and some red and pink for the wax seals. The writing was just a few quick strokes of indigo using our liner brush, which we'll also be using for our final blue highlights. Of course, you could easily call things done at this stage, but I wanted to come back to our colour theory and show a few different ways we can get some interesting final highlights. I've got some of that brown grey I used for the scrolls on the palette, and mixing in some blue I can make a very nice blue grey. It almost blends in with my tile here, but once it's on the mini you can see how it really looks. For the purple marine, I've gone with some brilliant yellow pale into the blue instead, which also desaturates it, but in a way that shifts it more towards green, which contrasts really nicely with our purple foundation. And for our brown marine, I've used more or less straight white with blue. This causes our final highlight to pop against the brown foundation, as a purer blue is going to contrast much more strongly with it. In all three cases, we're staying focused on the edges and the uppermost points, working in smaller and smaller areas as we go. The side of our brush can also catch the edges, and the tip is fine enough to draw along the flats. Like before, I can use my blending brush to smooth out the transitions, and a wash to re-establish any recesses I've run over. But for this step, we want our brightest highlights to be clearly defined. And here they are all finished. Same blue across three different foundations. With a bit of colour theory, we can get a very different result using just a few colours, and thanks to the magic of oils, not a lot of effort. And this is a few days later after they've dried and I've had a chance to hit them with some matte varnish, just to knock that shine down. Let me know in the comments which one's your favourite. I hope this has been helpful, and I'll encourage you to try out mixing your own colours, whether it was with oils or acrylic, or at the least has given you a few ideas for enhancing your blues through colour theory. Thank you very much for spending time with me here today. If you have any questions about any of the products or techniques I've talked about today, or have a topic you'd like to see me cover in a future video, please let me know down in the comments below. Again, thanks very much for being here, and take care.